Today we will discuss a topic that I have mentioned many times in my lectures in passing, but today we're going to shed a little bit of extra light, and it is especially relevant given the circumstances right now in Gaza and in Palestine, and that is our history as a Muslim ummah, our relationship with the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years before the creation of Israel, for the last 15 centuries. Because the fact of the matter is that it is truly sad in light of our contributions to the survival and the flourishing of these demographics that they seem to ignore and neglect all of these centuries of positive interactions. Because the fact of the matter, once again, Christian Europe treated this demographics in a very different way than we did. And multiple times in history, the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim civilization played a vital role in protecting hundreds of thousands of persecuted Jewish people. So we need to be aware of this, and we need to know our own history. And again, only so much can be said for the history of 15 centuries. But as you're roughly aware, we went over this in detail this earlier part in a number of lectures. In the year 70 CE, in the time of Jesus Christ, after Jesus Christ, the second temple was destroyed, and so Judaism once again had its diaspora. They fled across the globe, so they didn't have a land. For the next 2,000 years, where were the Jewish people? Under Christian and then Muslim rule. For 1,500 years before 1947, 1,400 years before 1947, where were the Jewish people? Either in Christian lands or in Muslim lands. Okay, what is the difference between how the Jewish people were treated in Christian lands versus how they were treated in Muslim lands? This is the summary we're going to be discussing today. And of course, the goal is to pique your curiosity. The goal is to start you on the journey. Obviously, in 15, 20 minutes, only so much we can do. We need to understand Christianity from its inception has been extremely intolerant of the Jewish people. Why? Because according to their theology, what did the Jewish people do to their own God, to the Son of God? Well, according to their theology, what did they do? They murdered the Son of God. So from the beginning, there's a term that is found in Christian literature. I'm not inventing this term. It's called Christ killers. This is what they called the Jewish people, Christ killers. And that is why, generally speaking, in ancient Christianity, medieval Christianity, Jewish people were not treated as equal citizens. They didn't have the right to own property in most of European history. They were forced to live in special areas. The ancient term for this in Venice, the Venetian term, is still used in English. Guess what that term is? Ghetto. That term ghetto, where does it come from? Now we use ghetto to mean what? A very poor, very impoverished part of the city. Well, it was called ghetto for the first time in Venice in the 1200s from a Venetian term to mean low class. It's literally a term that was used for Jewish people. The term ghetto in English comes from them having to live in a separate place of the city. Jewish people in Europe were prohibited from any noble profession. They had to take ignoble tasks. They were prohibited from owning land. They were prohibited from rising up in the ranks of nobility. In fact, the one job that they were not prohibited to do, and that's why they started to do this more and more, was the job that was prohibited by the church, and that is lending of money. The church said you cannot lend money on interest. And Christians, if they do so, they're going to go to hell. They're going to be damned. This is Christian law, by the way. Jewish people were exempt because they're not Christian. And they couldn't work in so many other areas. This is not anti-Semitic. I'm teaching you history. This is a fact. Jewish people then took on, by and large, in Europe, the profession of money lending, charging interest, because they weren't allowed any other job. They weren't allowed careers, and this was prohibited by the church. You'd be damned. So what did they do? They became the proto-bankers, the first bankers. And so what's going to happen, slowly but surely, their wealth did increase. This is not a anti-Semitic. It's the fact of the matter is that they were involved in this profession, and that is why rich dynasties from this group did begin to rise in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. But that's because They were the ones lending money. Eventually, the church had to buckle under pressure and change their law and say it is now allowed for Christians to do. Otherwise, Christians forbade Christians from lending money with interest. It was haram for them. The church would excommunicate you. That's why this group began to do this. In the 11th century, when the Crusades was announced, in 1095, 1096, the first Crusaders, they left England, they left Italy, they left France, and they made their way to Jerusalem, wanting to free, quote unquote, Jerusalem from Muslim lands. Do you know what happened before they reached Jerusalem? They started massacring Jewish people. Where? In Europe. Why? What has that got to do with Jerusalem? They began to reason, if we're going to go to Jerusalem where Jesus walked, we should avenge his death before we get there. And so, thousands, this is the first time where pogroms happened against Jewish people. Entire cities in Europe, entire cities in Germany, this is in 1096, 1097, entire cities were decimated from their Jewish populations. It is really pathetic what the Christians did. The women and children ran to the synagogues begging for freedom, and they burnt the synagogue with babies in it. They burnt it. Who? The Christians. Why? Because these are Christ killers. I say this because you need to know, where is this anger? Where is this anti-Semitic coming from? It's coming from Europe. We Muslims had nothing to do with any of this hatred. And you need to know the irony of how we can be accused when in reality this notion of anti-Semitism comes straight from Europe. In the year 1215, the church gave a decree that Jewish people could not live like normal citizens in any Christian land. They had to wear a different clothing. They had to live in different places of the city. They had to have specific professions. This is the Vatican. This is the church normalizing the discrimination of Judaism. This is in 1215. Don't be surprised in a few decades, 1290, King Edward of England said, I don't want any of these people in my kingdom. So he made a decree to expel every single member of the Jewish faith from England. For 400 years, there were no Jewish people in England. 400 years. Why? Anti-Semitism. The king said, none of these people are going to be here. And Shakespeare writes his plays during this time. But the stereotype, the negative, evil stereotype remains in the psyche of Europe. Go read Shakespeare's plays. Go read how he writes about Shylock the Jew. This is Shakespeare, not me. Shakespeare is an anti-Semite in every sense of the term. The stereotypes, the negativity, and ironically, he's never interacted with the Jewish person because there are no Jews in England when Shakespeare's writing because of the decree. Only in 1680 or something, the king relents and allows them back in. And that is why, by the way, to this day in England, the Jewish population is very small compared to other places in Europe because for 4 centuries, they were banned. And one of the worst manifestations of anti-Semitism took place in Andalusia, but not under us. When Ferdinand and Isabella Reconquista, when they conquered Granada, the Muslim land, when they conquered Granada, the first decree, less than 1 week or 1 month after they took power, 1492, they made the decree. It's called the Decree of Al-Hamra because it was in the Hamra Palace. There shall be no Jewish people living in Andalusia. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish people were forced to convert to Christianity or were sent into exile. The entire population of Iberian Spain, and there were, we don't know, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 Jewish people, they were either forced to convert under torture or they had to flee for their lives. And this is one of the worst manifestations. Now you get to Hitler in the 1930s and 1940s, which is, of course, the worst anti-Semitic outburst in all of human history. And this needs to be said bluntly. Hitler did not come in a vacuum. Hitler is tapping into mainstream Christian notions of anti-Semitism. The term anti-Semite, the birth of anti-Semite, the notions of anti-Semite, it has nothing to do with Arabs and Muslims. It is European and Christian through and through, 100%. Even the term is invented by the Christians and used by the Christians. This is just a summary of Christian lands. Let's move on to Muslim lands. Subhanallah. wherever Muslims went and there were Jewish people, the Jewish people faced a type of flourishing. They were given a type of protection they could never find in Christian lands. And when Muslims conquered what is currently Iraq, what is currently Iran, Iraq had a large population of Jews in Baghdad from the time of the first expulsion, not even the second, from 500 BC, because the largest group of Jews from the first expulsion, they went to Iraq. So Muslims found large groups of Jews in Iraq. In Iran, Isfahan, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people, again from the first and second expulsion. And the Muslims came and found them, and they gave them protection under the Treaty of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Jerusalem, when Umar ibn al-Khattab marched into Jerusalem, guess how many Jewish people were there? Zero. Guess how many synagogues? Zero. Jews were not allowed to worship in Jerusalem under the Christians. Guess who gave them the freedom to build the first synagogue after the collapse of the temple? It was none other than Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. Umar ibn al-Khattab, acting upon Islamic commandments, acting upon prophetic guidelines. Jews and Christians are Ahl Kitab. They have the right to live freely. They have the right to worship. They have the right to build their synagogues and whatnot. Now, modern liberals come along and they say, oh, the conditions of Umar al-Khattab are second-class citizenship. I'm not going to claim that Umar radiallahu anhu's condition is the same as secular America. It's not. But we're not comparing Umar ibn al-Khattab to secular America. Secular America is a different notion where religion plays no role. In the Islamic scheme of things, religion plays a vital role. So if you're a Muslim, yes, you get perks and privileges, no doubt about that. And if you're Ahl Kitab, there's certain things. For example, you cannot convert people to your faith. For example, the synagogue minaret, or the temple in the synagogue cannot be higher than the minaret of the mosque. I agree these are conditions, but we're not comparing Umar ibn al-Khattab to modern liberalism. We're comparing Umar ibn al-Khattab to the rest of the world. The fact of the matter, never once in all of Islamic history was there a policy to kill all Jews. Was there a policy to persecute all Jews? Was there a policy to expel all Jews? So Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh allowed the Jewish people to come back into Jerusalem. This is the first time they could come back and build the first synagogue under the Khulafa al-Rashidun. And the rest, as they say, is history. That in Baghdad, when the Abbasids made their Baytul Hikmah, the famous house of wisdom, they hired the most competent translators regardless of their background. And because Muslim people weren't studying ancient Greek and whatnot, some of the best translators were from a Jewish background because they're the ones studying ancient Greek, ancient Latin. And so Baytul Hikmah hired the top Jewish minds to be in charge of the House of Wisdom. And when the Fatimids and when the Umayyads of Spain instituted their own Baytul Hikmah, because they wanted to compete, there are three khilafas, they wanted to compete with one another. So they made their own institutes of publishing. They also hired the best and brightest minds, regardless of their background. Jews and Christians were at the top of this list. You have to understand why. Muslims weren't studying ancient Greek and whatnot. These civilizations were. So the Khulafa and the Sultans hired these people and gave them the best salary so that they can work with them. And one of the most interesting examples in our own history in Andalusia was under the Ta'ifa kingdom of Granada in around 1000, 1030 CE, like basically literally 1000 years ago, the prime minister of Granada, the Sultan was Muslim. The prime minister was a rabbi, and his name is Ismail ibn Naghrillah. Ismail ibn Naghrillah. And he was a rabbi. He was a learned man. He rose in the ranks until he became the prime minister of Cordoba. This is a Jewish person, and the people loved and respected him. The Muslim population loved and respected him. The books of history mention that when the Reconquista began, because Reconquista took 500 years, right? When it first began, Ibn Naghrillah, this Jewish vizier, was leading the Muslim army in jihad to defend Cordoba against the Crusaders. Can you believe this? And because in those times everybody dressed up in a particular garb, they wore Quranic, talismans for the time. Ibn Naghrillah, it is said, wore the Quranic coat of armor, verses of the Quran, and he's leading the Muslims in actual jihad against the Christians who are invading against Qurtuba, and he defends and he wins and he protects Qurtuba. So this is the reality of Jewish life under the rule. Now, some people point out that 20 years later, a mini massacre occurs. And this, you have to be careful, sisters and brothers. When you read these types of things, do your research. Do your research. It is true. A mini massacre occurred against the Jews of Qurtuba. But why? I'll tell you why. You won't find this too often because people just want to say, oh, the Muslims rebelled and they massacred hundreds of Jewish people in Qurtuba. It's true. But I'll tell you the story. This guy, Ibn Naghrillah, he died and he was buried with honors. His son, 21 years old, was given the next viziership as an honor that your father was the vizier, you become the vizier. His son is Yusuf ibn Naghrillah. Yusuf turned out to be a traitor. And the first thing he does, he writes a letter to the next kingdom. If you invade on such and such a date, I'll make sure you win over the kingdom. I'll distract the army and whatnot. But there's one condition, you must make me the ruler and I'll pay taxes to you. Okay? So this guy, Yusuf, he attempted a coup d'etat. And he got his people to support him. And obviously his people were of a Jewish background. The letter was uncovered. The Muslims went wild. Mobs attacked the palace and literally shredded Ibn Naghrillah, Yusuf, the son of the famous one. They literally shredded him and tortured him to death. And then they turned on his core, killed him. And then it is true, sad, the mobs turned on the Jewish quarter because they thought this was a Jewish revolt against the city. And innocent people lost their lives. But the point is, no sultan gave the command. No government instituted this. And the reason why it happened was not because they were Jewish. It's because the notion came that the entire community is treacherous to us. That's why this happened. Then things went back to normal and Jewish communities began to flourish. Within 150 years, the greatest Jewish mind in all of Jewish history was born and raised and studied in Qurtuba. Who is this person? Who can tell me? Musa ibn Maymun. Rambam is what the Jewish people call him. The holy rabbi, Rambam. Memorize this name. That's a title, honorific title. Musa ibn Maymun, Moses Maimonides. In the entire history of Judaism, there is no theologian that is more respected and venerated than Rambam. Rambam, Moses Maimonides, born and raised in Qurtuba, traveled the Muslim world, died and is buried in Egypt, in Cairo. He spoke fluent Arabic. He went through the madrasa systems. In those days, if you wanted to study, you went to the madrasa, right? And the madrasa is religious. So you study the sciences along with Quran and tafsir and hadith and fiqh. So Musa ibn Maymun, as a Jewish student, was not just given the freedom, he excelled in his studies. And his biographers mentioned this. I'm not making this up. Read his modern day biography. He lived like a Muslim, prayed like a Muslim, recited Quran like a Muslim. Nobody forced him. It was free. Andalusia, you could be who you are. But he was in such awe of Islam that some people say he secretly converted for a few years. Allahu A'lam. But he lived like a Muslim in the dorms. And there was no pressure because in Andalusia, there was a type of religious freedom that was not found anywhere in Europe. You could be a Christian, you could be a Jew, you could be a Zoroastrian, you could be a Muslim, and everybody lived freely in Andalusia. But Rambam decided to act like and memorize the Quran like a Muslim. Eventually, he goes back to his rabbi, a profession, and he begins writing. Now, this deserves an entire lecture. I don't have time to get into there, but it is one of my areas that I love to read about because intellectual history is my area. Moses Maimonides, listen, I'll just summarize it. He took Islamic concepts and he Judaized them. Mainstream Judaism is influenced by Moses Maimonides, and Moses Maimonides is influenced by Islamic thought. Now, this is not a conspiracy. Again, look this up. In fact, there's an entire entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia. I just saw this today to make sure that I can reference to you. The Stanford Encyclopedia Online, which is one of the most largest online encyclopedias. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Intellectual Thought has an entire article, The Islamic Influences on Moses Maimonides. And of them, his proofs for the existence of God, his concept of God is coming straight out of Al-Farabi Al-Kindi. His notion of prophethood and what is prophethood, his notion of even theology. Pause here, footnote. This sounds strange, I know, but Judaism, by and large, did not concentrate, did not care about belief. Judaism cared about what? What? Law. Judaism cared about how you act. It had almost nothing to do with Aqidah. That's why they don't have any book on Aqidah. The first book of Jewish theology, who wrote it? Rambam. The first book. And you read this book, and you are reading Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi. You are reading Islamic Mu'tazili thought. His conception of God, of the attributes, of Qadr, his conception of prophethood, it is coming straight out of his madrasa training. And this is now mainstream Jewish belief. I'm not making this up. This is well known. Mainstream Jewish theology is coming straight out of Andalusian madrasa. He just changed it, made it a little bit. And he wrote a creed. To this day, the righteous or the observant Jewish people, the first thing they do when they wake up, they read Moses Maimonides' one-page creed. And it begins, Ana mu'minu, I believe in, just like Aqidah Tahawiyah, just like other Aqidas, it literally begins, I believe in, and there's 13 points. I believe in God, there is one